Now that you've got your sample, it's time to get the macroinvertebrates out so you can count them and identify them. So you open your broth pack, and it has in there, of course, the macroinvertebrates, but it's also got sand and gravel and leaves, sometimes sticks, and alcohol. So the first thing to do is to dump it into a sieve. So, after you've dumped your sample into the sieve, a lot of interesting macroinvertebrates will be stuck to the side of the bag. So it's really important that we don't miss any. So you wash them down with water. This water happens to be deionized water. It doesn't really matter though. Tap water is perfect. Whatever you've got will be fine. The bags are not reusable, so the best way to get things out of the bottom is to simply cut the bag. And we can throw that top half away and work with what's left behind. And give that bottom of the bag one more rinse, and you will get all of your bugs safely into the sieve. So we have an empty bag. At this point, usually there's a lot of alcohol in your sieve, and we want to drain that off because we don't want to be working with the alcohol. Once that alcohol is drained off, you must safely dispose of it, and now you can just use tap water to rinse your sample a little bit more. And so lots of water to rinse out the alcohol and redistribute your sample on the sieve. Alright, now you've got a sample on a sieve, and the next procedure is to transfer this to a cafeteria tray, another piece of high-tech equipment. And the cafeteria tray allows you to spread the sample out and to take what's called a subsample. So the cafeteria tray is measured off into equal squares and numbered 1 through 12, and that's because we're going to roll dice to determine which part of the sample gets analyzed and which part of the sample gets ignored. The reason for that is you will sometimes get so many bugs in your sample that you couldn't possibly count them all in the time you have available. So subsampling is important. It's really important to count at least 3 squares, which gets us a quarter of the sample, and that's the minimum that's required. We also need to get at least 80 macroinvertebrates from our sample. So you end up going through square by square by square until you get to 80. Sometimes you get to 80 in the middle of a square. You've got to finish the square though, you can't just do a half a square. And that's really important for mathematical corrections later. The next part of the procedure is to get all of your sample onto the cafeteria tray. It's best to do this in a very loud and aggressive manner. You want to flip this thing over and hit it really hard on the cafeteria tray one time. And we would squirt water through here also if necessary, but in this case it's pretty clean, so we don't need to. We have our sample on here now. What we want to do now is disperse it on the tray using some water. So we're just going to fill the tray up until there's approximately, half a centimeter or so, quarter of an inch of water in all the squares. A ruler, or in my case a pair of forceps because I have them, but you could use a pencil or whatever you've got. And the objective here is to evenly spread the entire sample through all these squares. And we'll roll the dice to determine which squares get analyzed. So to select which part of the tray that we're going to count from, we use 12-sided dice. Certainly cannot do this with a 6-sided dice, and 8-sided dice are no good either, so get rid of those. And so we have an 8. So we're going to wall off number 8 here. If any macroinvertebrates happen to be on the fence, whatever direction their head is pointed, that's how we determine what square they're in. So we're going to make our little walls here. The walls are important. We use dominoes, and the walls keep the macroinvertebrates from floating around as you're trying to take your sample. So it's important to get them right on the fence, on the line, and that's the first square we're going to pick. So now we start picking out our macroinvertebrates. Right off the bat I see a little stonefly here. I'm putting them into alcohol so that they'll stay preserved. It's really important. They were pickled initially in the bag, now they're in water because it's nicer to work in water instead of working in alcohol. But you need to put them back into alcohol so that they stay preserved. You need to go through, you need to move every stone, and if you see little aggregations of stones, you've got to pick them up because they could well be caddis flies. We'll roll the dice again and see what our next square is going to be. It's going to be square number 1. We'll repeat this procedure. We'll move our dominoes over to square number 1, wall it off completely, and get those macroinvertebrates. We'll do it a third time at least, and we'll keep going until the sum of our squares has exceeded 80 macroinvertebrates. And at that point it will be done and the rest of the sample gets discarded. At this point we need to get rid of the part of the sample that's not being quantified, and it's tempting to just dump it down the sink, but that will clog your plumbing. So it's important to run it through a sieve. If you're doing this in an outdoor situation, you could dump this out on sand somewhere or on grass. It really wouldn't be any harm. But what's important when you're working indoors is that you make sure you do not clog your plumbing. Mostly into the sieve. Some of it ends up in the sink and we scrape it out later. It's really important to record how many squares were picked for your sample. So in this case I picked 4 squares. Put that information right in the sample, along with the original sample label that you fished out of your sample. Pop a lid on there and your sample can now be safely stored for further use. And so that concludes your picking procedure. Your sample has been removed and your bugs are all in one place. The label has followed the bugs from the stream all the way into your vial, and later you can set that aside for identification. Anyone who picks that vial off the shelf, like this one for example, can tell that in this case, because it's properly labeled, it came from Browns River, Jericho, Vermont, and this one was sampled in 2015. So thank you for watching this Vermont At Score video, and we will see you next time where we will identify the macroinvertebrates.